Yes, I'm here.
Oh, wonderful. We're all here. So technology has, the gods of technology have shined their light on us today. I'm just going to introduce you, so hold on one second.
Thank you.
So our next speaker is Daryl Sharp, who is joining us from Canada through Skype. And we all love Canada. We want you to know that, Daryl. Daryl is a union analyst who has been practicing in Toronto since 1978. He's a graduate of the C.G. Jung Institute in Zurich, and he holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Math and Physics and a bachelor's degree in journalism from the University of Carleton in Ottawa, and a master's degree in literature and philosophy from England's University of Sussex. He's a training analyst at the C.G. Jung Foundation of Ontario and the author of over 24 books, and he's also the editor and publisher of Inner City Books, as I mentioned earlier, which has published so many of the books that we all read. He has recently released Anthony Stevens' latest work, the 3-volume trilogy that you saw in the film, on the Talking Cure, Psychotherapy, Past, Present, and Future. And his books and Anthony Stevens' books are available, as I mentioned, in our bookstore. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Anthony Stevens, to Daryl Sharp. It's all yours. It's all yours.
I think that's mine, Arnold. Thank you. And thank you, David, too, for facilitating this event. And good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My tribute to Anthony Stevens will be brief and very personal. I was pleased to be invited to say a few words, for Tony saved my life. Now I have to go back 41 years ago to 1972.
Why don't we ask him to focus the...
I was living in Toronto,
It's his screen, not ours.
but I was on holiday
Wait,
in
why don't we
London,
ask-
England, visiting friends. At home, I was having marital problems, and I was altogether at my wit's end in terms of my place in life, suicidal even. Now, the day after arriving in London, I awoke crying inconsolably. I go to my friend, Chuck Schwartz, an expatriate Canadian, since an analyst himself. I find him in the kitchen and I declare to him, I need help. Calm down, he says, I know someone if he has time to see you. Now, as it happens, the someone he knows is Dr. Anthony Stevens, who agrees to see me the next day. I arrive early at Tony's Harley Street office in tears. His secretary gives me a cup of tea and I spill it on my pants. I am a total mess. Tony soon appears and ushers me into a plush armchair in his office. He sits across from me. Tears are streaming down my face. I wonder what he will think of me. But I needn't have words. Tony listens to my situation, my woes and dreams, listens with empathy and sympathy, but says little. After an hour or so, he offers me more sessions if I want before I return to Toronto. I accept and I leave his office with a new skip in my step. Well, frankly, I don't understand what just happened, but I am no longer in tears. Before returning to Toronto, I agreed to see Tony again in a month or so. But I have business in Toronto, including my family. I have to fix things up there before I come back. But I put my affairs in order in Toronto, and in a month or so I fly back to London to continue analysis with Tony for the next 6 months. During that period, I developed a fanciful idea of training at the Jung Institute in Zurich. I need the recommendation of a certified Jungian analyst. When I tell Tony, he says, "Too bad, if I'd known you had training in mind, I wouldn't have taken you on." You see, I am not a certified Jungian analyst, meaning that he was not a member of the IAAP, International Association of Analytical Psychology. However, he did not discourage me and subsequently enlisted the support of his mentor colleague, Irene Champernau. Tony writes of her in the Talking Cure, Volume 3. Irene's recommendations were highly regarded by the Jung Institute at that time. She died a little later. However, she interviewed me and gave her blessing. I was accepted into training, though I had to wait until the following year. I returned to Toronto to bide my time. Tony and I kept in touch through letters, and in 1974 I began training in Zurich. When I graduated in 1978, I had a better grip on my vocation and a good idea of my strengths and weaknesses. That's what Jungian analysis is designed to do. Soon after I was back in Toronto in 1980, I founded Inner City Books, devoted exclusively to the work of Jungian analysts, still the only publishing house in the world that has that mandate. But I want to say here that all my subsequent success in life all began with Anthony Stevens believing in me a hapless puer. And he did it with, not with logos, left brain theory, but with eros, right brain feeling, intuition, and imagination. So I was thrilled at the opportunity to publish his Archetype Revisited in the year 2000, and then in 2012, his comprehensive 3 volumes, 3 volumes survey of psychotherapy, The Talking Cure. Thank you. Tony, I love you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daryl. Very moving. Very. And I know you will be very, very much touched to see it.
Okay, thank you, David, again for arranging all this and for inviting me.
Well, it's such a pleasure. It's such a pleasure that it is. And we're very. Okay, we're signing off now. Thanks again.
You're welcome. We'll cut it off then.
Okay. Bye-bye. Have you read the story of how Daryl Sharp got Marie-Louise von Franz to agree that he should be her publisher? It's in I think it's in at least one of his books, if not more. And the basic thing is, you ask.
Ask and it shall be given unto you.
Yes. Okay, so our next speaker is Dr. Ellen Maloney, who is a Jungian analyst and psychiatrist in private practice in San Francisco. He is an adjunct clinical associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Stanford School of Medicine, where he did his psychiatric residency, and co-founder and president at Cogent Medicine. He received his medical degree from Tufts University School of Medicine and did his residency in radiation oncology at the University of California, San Francisco School of Medicine. He's a graduate of the C.G. Jung Institute of San Francisco, where he's currently an analyst member. And he's published extensively, including articles on Darwin and Jung in a New Psychiatry, and archetype theory, evolutionary psychology, and the Baldwin effect. Will you explain the Baldwin effect today?
No, not today.
Okay. Too much.
That's, if you give me another half an hour, maybe.
Okay. Very good. His lecture today is entitled Beyond the Night Sky, A Perspective on Science and Humanism. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Alan Maloney.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today and to have a chance to speak with you all, and it's a privilege to participate in honoring Dr. Anthony Stevens. Dr. Stevens has made prolific contributions to the worlds of both depth psychology and evolutionary psychology. And while there are many contributions that Dr. Stevens has made, the one I'd like to draw attention to and elaborate today is his capacity to think about a range of disciplines that bear on human psychology in a rigorous and at the same time holistic fashion. Resisting the pole of polarizing academic disputes is harder than it may sound. Many very smart people get tripped up when thinking about how to reconcile distinct but convergent ideas. It is, I think, this ability to hold on to findings from different disciplines while refusing to violate the integrity of any of them that is, to me, the most appealing aspect of his work. And it is this commitment to suffer this tension in pursuit of a fuller understanding of human experience that has relevance not only for the theory of depth psychology, but also for therapeutic practice of analysis and the synthesis of different but convergent disciplines that bear on our understanding of human psychology. In this holistic approach, Dr. Stevens is in good company. We're here today at the C.G. Jung Foundation in New York, and we remember how Jung repeatedly advocated for the holding of opposites and avoiding false dichotomies, and to my mind, eschewing stylistic syncretism. Analytic psychology has distinguished itself as an approach to depth psychology that holds the full range of human experiences and expression as legitimate topics of psychological inquiry, and therefore is able to consider topics such as religion, symbolism, and art as manifestations of psyche rather than alien, defensive, or illusory. If we're determined enough to want to benefit from the power of scientific insight and also want to benefit and want to respect the integrity of subjective experience, we need this sort of holistic approach, and personally I think we should be that ambitious. As I've played with the question of what perspective or framework is most useful for the project of integrating the fullest range of results that bear on human nature, bear on the nature of human psychology, I often reflected on this Flammarion wood carving, sometimes called the atmosphere. I have a colorized version here to give a backdrop to my talk, as I've used it as a backdrop for my reflections. This image has helped me organize my thinking about this question. The image was known to Jung. It was discussed in Flying Saucers, a Modern Myth, where he commented on the juxtaposition of the material and the projected elements. In the image, at least two levels of experience are present simultaneously. It is an image of both the material world and the eternal dimension, which brings the whole into view. It's an image of bridging or straddling two different realities, which are nonetheless coincident and co-occurring. One of the insights this image helped me with is that while projection is an essential element in learning about the world, it can also create biases that need to be contended with. In relatively recent times, we have learned that the psychic reality of the heavens was initially projected onto the canvas of the sky. This projection of ourselves onto the sky made it familiar and comprehensible. In time, we withdrew that projection and we deepened our understanding of ourselves and became more psychological. In our contemporary era, we are now learning how our intellectual perspectives bias our understandings of objective scientific results, and in a preliminary fashion, we're actually learning more specifically how these biases operate. This is opening a new set of challenges for the world of psychology, and the cycle of analysis, separation, and integration continues. In the past 10 years or so, important intellectual support for this sort of robust, holistic approach has been developing. These developments have happened in two areas in particular. One is systems biology, and the other is decision theory. These disciplines suggest how we might examine the full range of results that bear on human psychology without falling prey to the atomizing effect of reductive science, and how we can move beyond emergence in integrating disparate results. Systems biology is a biology-based interdisciplinary field of study that focuses on complex interactions. It is consistent with reductive science and dependent upon the role of emergence. However, its focus is system-wide, holistic, and not bottoms-up. System biology posits a complex system as the appropriate framework for considering higher-order biological investigations. This allows not only for the observation of emergent phenomena, but for the generation of new hypotheses at a higher order of interaction, which can then be empirically tested. The essential feature that I want to draw attention to is that it does not limit the inquiry to the fundamental or even the emergent level. This approach to biology is the intellectual framework which has allowed for disciplines such as genomics and the other omics such as proteomics, epigenomics, and biomics to develop. I believe that bottom-up approach comes with biases that create serious limitations and pull consideration in the direction of reductive and emergent perspectives, and that a systems approach overcomes these limitations. So that's a bold statement. Why do I think that? Well, that brings up the discipline of decision theory. Decision theory is a field that was developed largely by Amos Tversky, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that, and Daniel Kahneman. They won the Nobel Prize in 2002 in economics for their contributions to decision theory. Decision theory explores how certain types of cognitive biases operate. So it helps us understand that the perspective we bring to a question shapes what we consider. And that information that may appear incidental can actually anchor people's thinking and bias people's perceptions. So let me give a real-world example of this. As mentioned, I did some training in radiation oncology. I actually started doing radiation oncology before I switched into psychiatry. And when I was a resident in radiation oncology, it was very clear to me that how you spoke with patients about their survival had a profound effect on their mental states. My colleagues in radiation oncology weren't always so convinced that there was any difference between telling someone that they had a 90% chance of survival instead of telling them they had a 10% chance of mortality. This in some ways is understandable. They both describe the same objective odds. That said, for most people, they evoke very different reactions. These unconscious effects are not just emotional. Decision theory has shown they bias cognition as well. So why does all this matter? Well, it matters because we approach the integration of convergent fields with an awareness of our biases. If we don't approach it with an awareness of our biases, we leave our projections unexamined, and we put at risk a more integrated model of psychology. We end up with either atomized perspectives or a perspective that creates false choices, which can have very real consequences. This can happen even for some very smart people. And my example of that is some of the work contributed by Stephen Jay Gould. Stephen Jay Gould was an evolutionary biologist who became a public intellectual and a commentator on the emerging thoughts around science and humanism. In time, he became a strong critic of evolutionary psychology. He ridiculed it as a collection of just-so stories that were merely charming and had no more explanatory power than some other made-up story. He, at the same time, was also a defender of the validity of religion and religious experience. But he held that science and religion were what he called non-overlapping magisteria. That's a mouthful. What he meant by that was that they were independent traditions and they did not overlap. There was no overlap between the two of them. So years ago, I was at an HBES meeting. HBES was the Human Behavior and Evolution Society meeting, where Gould presented an early version of this idea and generated a very strong reaction. He was challenged, critiqued, accused of being intellectually dishonest, and even booed. I was sympathetic to his perspective because I too value the integrity of subjectivity, and I admired his willingness to take a public position so at odds with the assembled group. It struck me as personally courageous. In time, though, I began to realize the broader implications of his position. While he appealed to me as an apologist for subjectivity, he was asserting that religion and science had no common ground and no overlap. This seemed odd to me because in my mind, religion and religious features are pretty clearly part of psyche, and as such can be considered in an integrated fashion. It seemed to me that Gould was basically proposing a split as the price we needed to pay to preserve the sanctity of individual experience. This came to strike me as a sort of a desperate stance, that we perpetuate a split and leave unintegrated certain aspects of human experience in order to protect religion and religious experience. This is not only psychologically problematic, I think it's an intellectual dead end. As I considered Gould's argument in this ongoing debate, it occurred to me that his criticism of just-so stories was too clever by half. In science, hypotheses are generated within a framework which can then be tested. Evolutionary psychology often uses an adaptionist framework. Something like, what is the adaptive value of this trait, gene, or behavior? However, evolutionary psychology doesn't end there. It generates ideas and then tests them. It may use an explanatory framework to generate novel ideas, but it employs scientific techniques to confirm or refute them. Gould's appeal to split what type of experience can be considered scientific and what types are to be considered religious is problematic. There's been a robust criticism of his idea of non-overlapping magisteria, but to my mind it's principally come from the community of skeptics and not the community of humanists. For example, Susan Jacoby, who's the director of the Center for Inquiry here in New York City, criticized the validity of the non-overlapping magisteria idea with the observation that science can determine whether a particular received religious belief increases or decreases human suffering. Her position is that science therefore has the moral standing to address that belief. And while the community of humanists may feel, as I initially did, comforted by the apparent advocacy of subjectivity in the concept of non-overlapping magisteria, it strikes me now as a bad bargain. I don't think that we should be so insecure about the integrity or sanctity of subjective experience that we would half blind ourselves in an effort to protect it. Subjectivity, religion, and religious experience are not dependent on science for validity. They are subjective realms. But even when examined in the light of science, they hold their own. Let me give an example. Right before I left San Francisco to come here to New York for this meeting, I did a brief Medline search for clinical trials that used mindfulness as a clinical intervention. Medline is the National Library of Medicine's 14 million citation database of medical scientific literature. Mindfulness is a tenet of Buddhism, which is, of course, a religion. When I did this search, there were 300 clinical trials reported that report results empirically examining the effect of mindfulness. The idea that we should not integrate the wisdom and experience of religion in our thinking about psychology simply doesn't make sense. When there is a psychological dimension to religion, it can be included in and inform scientific study. The idea that we have to choose between scientific rigor and the sanctity of subjectivity is an offer I think we should simply refuse. I think the alternate perspective that we can is that we can productively employ is the systems approach, something akin to systems biology. I've spent some time pointing out the risk of not using this approach. Now let me give you an example that demonstrates its value and I think shows how it allows for the exploration of scientifically testable ideas that would not be apparent from a reductionist nor even an emergent perspective. So to do this, I'm going to use the example of the scientific study of the serotonin reuptake gene. Everybody knows about serotonin and the serotonin reuptake protein. Genes, as you all know, are stretches of DNA that code for a particular protein. We get 2 copies of most genes. One is from mother and one from father. Some genes have only one form. Some have variations called alleles. This particular gene has 2 versions. One is a short version, usually called S, and the other version is a long version called L. So there are 2 versions of the gene. You can have you can have 2 short versions of the gene, and you then would have short from both mother and father. You can have a short and long version of the gene from mother and father, or from father and mother. And you can have the version with 2 copies of the long version of the gene. Some scientists are interested in understanding the effect of genes and the effect they produce in organisms during the course of life. Because a particular gene can produce 2 functioning versions of the same serotonin transporter protein, scientists were curious to know if the long or short version was associated with risks for depression, anxiety, or neuroticism, which is basically a good, sound, reductive scientific question. The problem was that as scientists began to try to understand this, for about a decade, they couldn't get a handle on whether the short version put individuals at risk for things like depression. Some studies showed that the S allele, the short version of the gene, was associated with higher rates of things like depression. Some scientists began to think of the S version of this gene as something akin to a depression gene. Pretty reductive. If you had an S allele, you were a little bit of a sitting duck. However, other studies, which were just as methodologically rigorous, failed to find any link between having the S allele and things like depression. In time, researchers began thinking that maybe the effect of the gene wasn't so straightforward. Maybe its contribution to things like depression might be dependent upon certain life experiences, perhaps negative life experiences. This is an emergent perspective on the gene effect. Nature and nurture interact to produce a predictable outcome. Well, sure enough, when researchers began to look at the interaction of the gene variations and the environment, they found that people who had the S allele and negative life experiences had higher rates of things like depression. So by looking at this question from an emergent perspective, scientists were able to make sense of their earlier findings. they began to think of the S allele as a vulnerability factor. If you had this version of the gene, you were at risk for things like depression. At this point, you sort of come to the end of the road of what you can do with reductive or emergent thinking. Okay? It's about as far as you can go. Fortunately, scientists don't actually think this way and don't typically work this way. They're beginning to argue less and less this way. What happened was that some scientists began to ask the question at sort of the system level, okay? Which is, what role does the short version of the gene play in individuals and in populations? It's maybe just a kind of just so story, as Stephen Gould might say, but an interesting one, and it turns out a testable one. Perhaps one of the possibilities could be that the short version of the gene had some adaptive psychological potential, and that symptoms that appear pathological may actually serve some other purpose, either in the individual or the population at large. Well, as commonsensible as that seems, it is outside the scope of the reductionist science. It is even outside the scope of emergence to develop such a hypothesis. Because even though it relies on emergence, it is informed by the features and qualities of the system as a whole, rather than the component parts that produce the emergence. It is very much consistent with a systems approach, an adaptivist approach, or a homeostatic approach to psychology. Well, the great thing about science is that it does move forward. So sure enough, in 2012, a paper was published in that celebrated humanist journal, Genes, Brain, and Behavior. The authors looked at the short and long version of the genes and the effect of both negative and positive life experiences. They specifically had an eye to understand what the purpose of the S version might be from sort of an adaptionist perspective. And what they found was really interesting and, to my mind, delightful and informative. Subjects with the S allele and negative life events were vulnerable to depression, and subjects with the L allele were less affected by negative life events. Subjects with the L allele were, in some ways, more resilient. Subjects with the S allele, who reported both positive and negative life events, interestingly reported that their positive life events were more salient in their experience. And subjects who had the S version, the short version, who had a preponderance of positive life events, were much happier and satisfied in their lives than those who had the L version and had positive life events. So these results change one's thinking about the S allele. It's not a depression gene, as perhaps seen from the reductive perspective. It's not a vulnerability factor, as seen perhaps from the emergent perspective. It's a plasticity factor, as seen from this more holistic perspective. This perspective accounts for all the early results. It also removes the element of genetic misfortune, explains not just the gene, but how we might think about this gene, and how genes may have an effect on subjective experience and behavior, not only as potential deficits, but as components in a complex system. This holistic system, this holistic perspective, is a framework which allows for the integration of findings from a variety of related disciplines. It is consistent with reductive and emergent science, and it respects the integrity of individual experience. A few weeks ago, President Obama announced plans for the Brain Initiative project to map the connections of the human brain, what some people call a neural connectome. What has been a growing stream of scientific results that bear on psychology will in time become a torrent. The question of how to integrate these findings with perspectives that respect and dignify human agency and subjectivity becomes an even more pressing question. So in closing, I'd like to acknowledge Dr. Stevens' work as being done in the spirit, which is both an accomplishment and an important contribution to our understanding of psychology. Thank you.
Could you say again where that image comes from?
It's from a collection of wood carvings. The publisher was a fellow by the name of Flammarion, and it's a woodcut that was probably done in the 18th century. It looks a little older than that, but it's probably more recent. It-
where would one find it?
You can find it easily on the internet if you type in atmosphere, Flammarion, and you'll find it in Flying Saucers, a Modern Myth, where Jung comments on it in the collection of images.
You can find it in our.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
How
there
do
you go, of
spell
course.
Flammarion, F-L-A-M-E-R-I-A-N?
FL, exactly right. Yeah,
If you look at Google Images, you'll get about 38.
yes.
Do you have an explanation of why the scientific, that aspect of the scientific community represented by Gould is so resistant to this holistic approach?
I think it really comes down to what's a very understandable sense of urgency that some of these people, Gould, I think in particular, really wanted to preserve the integrity and sort of protect religion and religious experience from more skeptical or cynical critics in the scientific community. And some people are very harsh in their criticism of things like subjective experience, religion experience, Dawkins, I think, as an example. But there's a fellow by the name of Franz der Waal who does a lot of ethological and evolutionary psychology research, and he likens some of the criticism of skeptics of religion to people standing outside a movie theater shouting that Leonardo DiCaprio was not really on the Titanic. And that it really sort of lacks a perspective and an understanding about the quality of the experience. And so I think there's a sense that there has to be sort of a devil's bargain. That in order to protect and advocate for subjectivity, you have to create this false firewall. But I think it really does damage. It creates a great deal of confusion. And I think it limits our understanding and our approach. I've had the unsatisfying experience of speaking with people, other analysts, about things like genetic effects in human biology and the human brain. And I've been asked to declare whether I believe that archetypes are metaphysical or if they're biological. I don't think that question makes any sense. You can look at nature and nurture. You can look specifically at nature. You can look specifically at nurture. But basically, you're talking about an interaction. And any perspective which doesn't respect the fact that it's an interaction is, to my mind, bizarre. So I think it's driven by things other than a particular scientific need. I think it's more a personal need to advocate for something worth defending. But it's done in a way which is unnecessary.
It's a very interesting response because I wouldn't have expected it. I would have thought that you would have talked about their need to, their fear that the scientific method would be compromised somehow.
That may be true. That may be true for some people, but I think for Gould talked very passionately about his respect for religion. So I think in his case particularly, it was something a little bit different.
Yeah, I don't see where having respect for something gives it a free pass, and I kind of agree with. When I would think our earlier speaker talked about, which would be that we are not this empty slate. There is something there to begin with, whether it's instinct or something else. And so I think you've asked a different question.
I'm not sure if I understand yours. Nothing I've said posits a blank slate. I'm not a fan of tabula rasa models of the mind.
Well, but if you're taking Gould's side to say that he has to protect religion out of respect for religion, I don't see that as a scientific reason.
I agree with you. I agree with you entirely. And that's why I think Gould's perspective was, an intellectual dead end. It's wrong-headed. So Gould is, for me, sort of a negative example of how people can get off track.
Okay.
So I hope I was clear about that, but if I wasn't, let me be clear. I think this is what I've loved so much about Dr. Stevens' work, is he's not fallen prey to this kind of either-or thinking. And I think that people like Gould have unfortunately done that. And there are other people in analytical psychology that fall prey to that. And they tend to come more on the subjective side and be a little bit more critical of the limitations of science. But I really think there's a broad and robust middle ground that brings into perspective, brings into focus a much more comprehensive view of the psyche.
The image is sometimes called an unus mundus image, the one world
Mm-hmm.
image, and that's uniting the two perspectives.
Right.
This may be a little off the point, but Young had relatively little to say about Darwin. I think 3 or 4 references in the collected works. And to my way of thinking, Darwin was a pretty hardcore, reductive thinking kind of scientist. Caused great problems, some problems in his marriage with his very traditionally religious wife. Now, Young likes to think of himself as both a scientist and a mystic, someone with spiritual outlooks, perspectives, and so forth. And I think that's where he's gotten in trouble, in the public mind at least, the fact that he carries both mantles, the scientist and the spiritual person. I think the marriage, if it's possible, of science and spirituality, religion, or whether it's better to keep them totally separate, it's an ongoing question, isn't it?
I don't think so, and let me be clear why I don't think it's an ongoing question. A lot of this is a problem with language. Okay, if by religion you mean the facts of received religious belief, yes, they are different disciplines. So if you're referring specifically to metaphysics, it is exactly beyond physics. Okay, but when you're talking about religious experience, that occurs in one of us, or in all of us, or in every single one of us, okay? Then you're talking about something which absolutely and positively overlaps with psychology. And that's where the idea of non-overlapping magisteria is just wrong-headed. So I think what's happened is that a lot of science that had to take place early on in understanding things like genes was by its nature reductive. Darwin, I think, was a reductive thinker, but I think it's also interesting to note he didn't publish Origin of the Species until he had to. Okay, so there was something that kept him from pulling that trigger for many years, and we can speculate what that is. My own speculation has maybe to do with his marriage, but I think more to do with his own conflict about what he saw as being potentially very disruptive to religion. He saw religion as a positive force. So my contention is that we don't have to leave these fields, when they overlap, separate. That in fact, when they overlap, it is legitimate to look at them from both perspectives, and that by doing so, we get a more stereoscopic, a more 3D view of what it is that we're contemplating, and we can actually see the world in a more holistic fashion.
Why did Darwin feel he had to publish it?
Because he was right, and he wanted to. I'm sorry. What was it? What was approximate trigger? It was who was about to publish?
Wallace.
Wallace. Thank you very much. Right. So one of his contemporaries who was working on the same idea was about to pull the trigger, and as we all know, the important thing is to be published first.
And by the way, Darwin had a dream just before he published that he would be hung.
Yeah. So, I mean, if that doesn't reveal some, yeah, okay, right.
I just want to say that around 1995 at MIT, I heard Gould give this is not significant, I just want to mention it, that at MIT he gave a lecture about the completing Darwin's work on the God hypothesis.
Mm-hmm.
And it was to bring Darwin's work to conclusion, which was to reject it.
Mm-hmm.
That's not what I want to say. I want to say something else. So you could regard the human being as having as functioning as a dynamic system
Yes.
within which there are at least two layers of systems that are interacting. One is genetic and one is psychic.
Yeah. I'd actually be a little more ambitious than that. There's a fellow at Stanford by the name of Richard Shepard. Richard Shepard has done some work that's gotten a lot of criticism about the way in which recurrent features of the environment are reflected in the adapted design of the organism. Okay? And people have rebutted that for all kinds of reasons, but I think the rebuttals are actually, I was joking before lunch today that in academics the point is not to be right, it's to make the other person wrong. And so people have managed to find faults with the way in which Shepard has argued this, but I'd point out that there are many features of our body that reflect the regularities of our world. And I think the most easily accessible is probably circadian rhythms. So there is a master circadian rhythm, if you will, in the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is a little spot above where the optic nerves crisscross in your head. But there are actually circadian rhythms in organs as well, independent of the suprachiasmatic nucleus.
But also in the psyche.
What I'm saying is that psyche and soma are two sides of the same thing. Okay, that so one of the things that is assumed about a circadian rhythm is that it is both self-regulating, okay, but also open to environmental input. Okay, so that what we think of as being sort of the barriers inside world, outside world, are probably not as crisp as they might appear. There's a blurring, and not just interpersonally through things like mirror neurons, which you mentioned earlier, but I think in our wider environment, and that environment includes both the terrestrial environment, but also a social environment. And I think that's meaningful. I don't think that's just a coincidence. I don't think that's something which should be left out.
If it's in a social environment, then you're interacting with other integrated genetic and psychic systems. So it's not really, and I just saw a painting over at this museum, this place over there called Delirium Vegetal by Henri Masson. And you might think of the psychic rhythms also of the vegetable world, you know, integrated with their own genetics.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right?
Absolutely, and the psychic rhythms of the vegetative mysteries of life and death, and that this is something that comes up with thinking about death and dreams sometimes. Is that death psychologically doesn't mean the end of things. Okay, we don't know for sure. There's very scant reliable evidence of what happens after you die. Okay, but what we do know is that death is not the end psychologically. The king is dead, long live the king. The winter comes, spring, the fall, the winter, spring comes. Life begins again and again and again. And it's the ability, I think, to respect the depth with which we're connected to the rest of the world that I think is, for me, one of the most compelling aspects of archetype theory.
Can you name specifically what areas of work are being done in this holistic mode? Any specific areas that you're aware of?
Yeah, in systems biology?
Yeah, systems biology.
Oh, well, systems biology is what gave us things like genomics and epigenomics, biomics. We're looking at what we'll probably call the neural connectome. So an example would be, I cited an example about thinking about genes and how to think about the specific gene. But what we've come to learn is that we're affected by multiple levels simultaneously in ways that are consequential. So for example, we all learned years ago that a gene is what produces a protein, which produces a structure which influences behavior. Well, it turns out it's a little more complicated than that a lot of the genes that we have are regulatory genes, and so they operate on sort of a meta level, if you will. It turns out that experience has an effect on the expressive tags on those genes, if you will. So we all learned that the idea was just wrong-headed, that a giraffe Linnaeus might think, evolve because it stretched more and more, and each generation the neck got longer. Well, giraffes didn't evolve that way, but it turns out that if you look at the epigenomic labeling of genes that affect the human nervous system, okay, and there's some collection of genes we know that are relevant to the human nervous system. If you look at the retention of the labeling of those genes, okay, from one generation to the next, it's incredibly high. It's 30%. Okay, so what that means is that it's not just our experience which can affect our functioning of our genes, but it's actually our parental experience that can affect the function of the genes, as well as the genes, as well as our personal experience. So we're not looking at one or two levels. We're looking at multiple levels, and we can't think about that using sort of reductive tools or even emergent tools. Okay, you have to think about it in a systems-wide fashion. So systems biology is new. It's only, I think Stanford was one of the first places to open a systems biology center, and it's only, I think, 10 years old. And there aren't that many in the country, but it's sort of an emerging paradigm in the biological sciences. I don't think I've heard it yet in the psychological sciences, but my guess would be that you'll see more and more of that in years to come. I certainly hope so.
Could you help explain the relationship between archetypes and natural selection?
I'm not sure that I can. So the short answer is no, but the on-the-spot answer is I'll try to wing it. I don't. How do I say this? I think that there are probably some archetypal dimensions that are more explicitly biologically based. For example, let's say whatever codes for the protein responsible for the master circadian rhythm in the suprachiasmatic nucleus, okay? And that if you had an organism that had a wrong length circadian rhythm, 40 hours, it might be tired when things are trying to eat it, and it probably would not survive to propagate its genes in subsequent generations. If you had a version of that gene that was not open to environmental inputs, and there was some seasonality, it lived at a higher or lower latitude, it might also not be plastic enough, and it might not be responsive and contingent enough to actually confer an adaptive advantage. So that one might get not passed on. But I think when we talk about archetypes, we're not talking about a single thing, we're talking about a category of things. So I think some are probably more, what did Jung say, psychoid, and some are more psychological, even if they all have biological bases to them.
That leads to the idea that natural selection is an archetypal idea.
Yeah, that's a wonderful way of putting it, and that's something which happens in the natural environment. Okay, that's something which precedes, and that's sort of a version of the reality of psyche, which is maybe eternal. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, our next speaker is David Napier. David Napier is Professor of Medical Anthropology at the University College London and founding director of the university's Center for Applied Global Citizenship. He's also the director of the University College London Science, Medicine, and Society Network. He holds a Doctor of Philosophy degree in social anthropology from the University of Oxford, and he's the author of numerous books and articles, including Masks, Transformation and Paradox, Foreign Bodies, Performance Art and Symbolic Anthropology, The Writing of Passage, Perceptions of Change After Modernity, and most recently, Living with Things, a handbook on environmental behavior. And I found out that his mother is a Jungian analyst. What a wonderful genetic inheritance. In appreciation of Anthony Stevens, David Napier will speak with us about why archetypes matter. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to David Napier.
First of all, thank you, David, for the warm introduction and also for the invitation to be here. And I suppose, given what you said about my mother and Anthony's views of maternal attachment, it's only appropriate that I dedicate this talk to her as a Jungian analyst who, she's had obviously enormous effect upon me, or otherwise I wouldn't be here right now. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon to celebrate the life and work of Anthony Stevens. If there is one word for me that captures Anthony's attitude towards life, it is adventuresome. One senses his ability to allow his mind to find new places and new ways of thinking, to venture boldly where so few will follow, and to allow the evidence of what he finds generate new lines of thought that are taken on unflinchingly and without any preconceived expectation of what others may think or how they may react to what his quest for knowledge uncovers. Anthony, in this regard, embodies a core idea that is considered by many to be critical to successful innovation, namely, as Peter Drucker once put it, first figure out what is the right thing to do, and then figure out how are you going to do it. For Anthony, figuring out the right thing to do is, as it was for Jung, a challenge of epic proportions. It is often lonely and dark, demanding not only particular kinds of strength, but a willingness to go it alone if necessary. It requires not only bravery in a traditional heroic sense, but sacrifice, because in difficult times, people do not figure out what the right thing to do is. They look around and ask themselves what is feasible, and then they make accommodations based upon limitations they have placed on themselves. That accommodating strategy may work in the short term. It will help with achieving what seems like progress on a day-to-day basis, but it will not help us in healing deeper social wounds. For such work, one needs to feel, as Jung himself did, that he was chosen by destiny to do what he did. The belief that one must and should go it alone, no matter what happens, is critical. For one will, under such circumstances, not necessarily receive the attention from others that one otherwise might garner. One may actually be ridiculed for saying things that are thought unpopular by nearly everyone. In this regard, Anthony has faced his critics unflinchingly. People always yearn for a good story, not just an engaging narrative in the sense of writing good novels, but they need to have options that are real to them, that they might otherwise not have thought of. And stories sometimes provide models of what others have done. This is not only the basis of all good therapy, but it is also, in hard times, sets those who think differently at great risk. The reasons for this are simple. When people feel betrayed by destiny, they doubt themselves. Because to feel betrayed, you need to acknowledge that you thought you had trust when it turns out you didn't. You have to acknowledge, in other words, that somehow you misread an agreement, legal, personal, social. You need to accept that what you thought to be the case turned out not to be the case. Now, this very act of acknowledging that you are wanting in your ability to make and keep moral contracts leaves you very vulnerable, because, as Nietzsche once famously said, any meaning is better than no meaning. People cannot, as Jung himself said, live without meaning. Quote, man cannot lead a meaningless life. And so, when people feel betrayed and are no longer in a position of not trusting themselves, they do what otherwise good people in Germany did in the mid-1930s. They choose bad meaning rather than no meaning. We see this process everywhere today. How many people, including political leaders of all ideological persuasions, nodded affirmatively to the statement that Iraq must have weapons of mass destruction, even though they were privately skeptical? How many legislators, except perhaps for the aging Senator Byrd of West Virginia, signed on to the Patriot Act that transformed the U.S. president from an executor of the will of the people to a legislator, one willing to act outside of congressional consent as our spokesperson? While Senator Byrd lobbied that we were turning the Constitution upside down, making it in effect a king of our president, most of the country thought about not what was the right thing to do, but of what was feasible and expedient in the face of unexpected disaster. Now, the president would have to act, to decide without the people. You may, of course, disagree profoundly with my views of this great alteration of the principles on which this country was founded. So let me give you a simpler example. As a college professor, I have the privilege of drawing the attention of my students to topics I take to be important. One of those topics has to do with moral commitment. To allow my students to understand the subliminal nature of shared ideas, I will, on occasion, walk into a classroom and incite a predictable response from an otherwise thinking group of people merely by touching collectively shared knowledge. Dare I call it archetypal knowledge in a particular way. For instance, if I want to show how deeply is our sense of collective betrayal, how vulnerable we now are, that is, to what von Franz called the demonic side of collective behavior, I can incite cynical laughter instantly in the first words I speak, simply by informing my students that today's lecture will focus on honesty in politics. There will always be outbreaks of laughter when I say this, not because it is funny, but because people feel so betrayed by those who lead them that laughter becomes a means of protecting oneself against acknowledging the depths of one's own sense of betrayal. And when perceived betrayal is endemic, we need more than ever for people to feel chosen, because they are going to have to go places where others will not go. Like a traditional shaman, they are going to have to do things for society that society cannot do for itself. In this role, that is, of a shaman, I liken Anthony Stevens to Jung, not because I see them as equally interested in the same things, but because I see Anthony as respecting Jung for embarking on a quest in which one looks back not to determine what is feasible, but to understand how one can bring the past forward, to get behind the past as the ancient Greeks understood the idea of the past, and move it ahead. However, to realize that one's own culture might be neglecting the darker side of humanity is to enter a very dangerous place. Dangerous for humanity because of the inclination to accept bad meaning rather than no meaning. Dangerous for the quest itself because being so outside of what is considered normal or feasible or politically correct can put your own survival at risk. Aldous Huxley once said about facts that they do not cease to exist because they are ignored. But when they are ignored or avoided in fear, or when discussion of them is closed prematurely because we fear the retribution of the crowd, they nonetheless have their consequences, and their evil can go unchecked if we are not willing to look at things squarely, to make provisions for how we can accept the unique difficulties of our era, and to get back to my earlier point, to figure out what is the right thing to do and act on it. For millions of years before humans could alter their gender at will, control their biology, and master most everything in their environment, humankind survived and may do not only through inequality, but through what anthropologists call systems of dual inequality. That is, systems of enforced reciprocity. I have skills that you do not have, and so I do for you what you are less able to do for yourself, as, for example, in my example of the shaman society. You, in turn, do things for me that I cannot do for myself. Men did for women sometimes what women frequently could not do for themselves, and women likewise for men. Historically, that is, men and women existed together to the degree that the smallest social unit was not often a person, but two people working towards their mutual social benefit, at the risk of women when it came to public acknowledgement and authority, at the risk of men when it came to biological longevity. These are historical facts, as Anthony reminds us. It will do us no good to suppress. But though a fairly obvious idea, dual inequality does not, and I emphasize should not, go down well in a modern world of wholly equal people who, for very good reasons, insist that we are all the same. However, that is not the case for the ancient past. For millions of years, families survived hardship by depending on roles that we now find stereotypical and mostly wrong. We no longer need men to do certain things for women, and women to do things for men. We no longer seem to want grandparents to provide wisdom to grandchildren, or to offer that wisdom as a form of fair exchange to indentured grandchildren who make sure that their elders are fed. Today, such separations are not only unhelpful, but they are also often illegal. We can't and shouldn't make such reciprocity obligatory. Yet, in the face of this, Antony has asked us some hard questions. If such relationships were key to human survival in our ancient past, are they also not then a deep part of our collective memory? If we have transcended such reciprocal forms of inequality, are we not now in danger when we ignore their ancient archetypal significance? And perhaps, most progressively, if masculine and feminine were our major biological markers of difference, how do we nourish a curiosity about difference in an era where people feel betrayed and afraid even of their own abilities to read accurately what social encounters with others actually mean? That is, afraid to engage with people unlike themselves, however defined, biologically, socially, morally. For me then, what is striking about Antony's understanding of gender is not that it conforms to historical beliefs that men and women are different, a belief that up until recently was, for better or worse, widespread, but that it calls our attention, as Antony shows clearly in Archetype and Archetype Revisited, to the archetypal importance of basic difference. I do not have time to develop this line of thinking today in detail, but let me give you one example of what I mean when I say I agree with Antony that gender, as an ancient archetypally evolved construct, needs to be attended to. For millennia now, the Bible tells us that man is a namer. Man names things. That is the Old Testament assessment. Historically speaking, man was the one who gave specificity and separation to things by labeling the otherwise amorphous things of this earth. Men defended boundaries. They imposed rigid categorical distinctions onto what cannot always be defined with certainty. Naming was historically man's duty, and when done arbitrarily, also his curse. One might even say that defining boundaries defined men as much as men define boundaries. What I mean here is that gender in itself is not important, but the archetypal activity associated with that defining activity actually is. In the 19th century, to take an important example we were just talking about in the question-answer period, Darwin introduced the ideas that would lead us to the association of survival with individual fitness. Darwin's views led us to think about survival in terms of inherited traits, and today, genetic dispositions, to focus on individual survival and less on group relations. Defining here is all about specificity, selfishness, autonomy, and separateness. That is, why one thing is what it is because it is not something else, to use the point that came up in the discussion. Naming is about separation, not about relatedness. Black and white are opposites that are not made meaningless by the introduction of gray matter. You take my point. So in some way, the survival of the fittest is historically a male-oriented way of thinking about life. It lacks almost completely any appreciation for why understanding the relatedness of things may be just as important as, or even more important than, the naming practices that the Bible metaphorically associated with men. But where are the women here? Intuition was the historical idea that associated a more feminist knowledge that did not depend on patrolling borders of ideas of culture, of society. Here, feminism, as so many feminists have argued, is not about biology. It is about understanding that there are greater kinds of understanding than those defined only by a focus on the selfish individual. Ecofeminism is a perfect example. This problem of knowing that knowledge exists beyond our ability to specify it is for me best summarized in a story form by an episode in the life of Mark Twain, the man that R.D. Laing, can I say Lang's name here? R.D. Laing rightly called the greatest of American philosophers. Musing not long ago over this problem of the specificity of knowledge, I came across a description of the first encounter between Rudyard Kipling and Mark Twain, one that seemed perfectly to encapsulate this categorical predicament. The much younger and public school precocious Kipling had journeyed from his new home in Brattleboro, Vermont, where he'd intended to become a woodsman and pioneer, to Twain's elegant, if overstated, home in Elmira, New York, to pay a visit to his favorite, then old, literary hero. As Stuart Murray points out in his wonderful book on Kipling's Vermont, Twain later wrote of the encounter with Kipling, and I'm quoting Twain here, "I believe that he knew more than any person I had met before, and I knew that he knew that I knew less than any person he had met before." Twain told his wife following the encounter, "Between us we cover all knowledge. He knows all that can be known, and I know the rest." Like most else of which Twain made humor, there is a dark message here that makes the absurdity of his remarks the more tragic. We all know that there are modes of understanding that are not easily given over to the sort of schoolboy fact-knowing that Twain saw in Kipling's control of knowledge. Is the rest that Twain claimed of his own kind of wisdom that comes of experience, or just plain ignorance allowed for by his typically ironic turn of phrase? At one level, his comment is just funny. At another, it's an extraordinary insight that carries with it the implicit awareness of so much that cannot be known discreetly, but nonetheless is made known to us by the flow of life, in the sense of being written about or otherwise specified, let alone labeled, classified, or owned. Twain's point, of course, is that knowledge, the other part of what he knows, is not given over to specificity and facts. It is not a traditionally male form of knowing. It is a part of life that cannot be separated from life as it is lived, the flowing experience of meaning. Twain here emerges philosophically as a powerful feminist voice, if you will. That is, as a voice that would today be called anti-Darwinian. So what does all this have to do with Anthony Stevens and his apparently politically incorrect suggestion that we should, as followers of Jung, take gender difference seriously? Well, first, there is the powerful argument that historical considerations of gender are actually, in the main, considerations of the importance of difference. If you are not humbled by someone or something you cannot know completely, you are unlikely to contribute much to moving the world forward. Jung knew this very well, which leads to a second important Jungian observation about gender in Antony's work. And this second point is this: if we do not examine carefully the historical importance of our traditional understanding of difference, we are unlikely to change it for the better in the future. If I must be honest, it is this part of Antony's work that I find so compelling and so humane. For it is not simply a patristic sentiment about helping those who cannot help themselves, in the shamanic sense I mentioned earlier, that I see at work in Antony's humanism, but a strong understanding of Jung that one cannot easily find elsewhere. Yes, Edinger had a deep understanding of Jung's interest in symbolism, and von Franz also understood how the neglect of the darker side of the shadow function could lead otherwise good people to do awful things. But Antony's appreciation of Jung is quite different. It reminds me of how male-oriented are our notions of biology and of health and illness. Let me give you an example. Take immunology, for instance. Today, neo-Darwinians have tried to defend the selfish maleness that they read into Darwin's ideas. We've heard today Richard Dawkins. His famous claim that gene lines, for instance, are themselves Darwinian may in fact be incontrovertible if we think of the survival of the fittest as a cultural parable. For would anyone deny the power of the idea to selfish thinkers, be they Victorian or modern? Everyone loves this story because it culturally comforts us each and every time we go to the gym and tell ourselves that we are taking control of our lives. Strong gene pools win, weak ones fail. But remember that the fitness and fittest concepts of Darwinism emerged in a very unequal Victorian climate in which men embodied notions of intervention, progress, and protection through oppressing the other, a world in which women had no rights, or at least only very unequal ones, and risks were largely understood as gateways to progress in which men would rule the globe. This, of course, was the same divinely ordained colonial world in which Darwin lived, the one that he too quite religiously believed in. In such a male-dominant model, the ways of other cultures can only be disruptive and invasive, suppressed or even eliminated if they threaten us, especially if what they bring is uncomfortable information about other modes of thought. But Darwin fails miserably when it comes to thinking about how we deal with risking our relations to something unknown that is for us individually perceived of as different. The survival of the fittest is all about prior, persistent, and autonomous beings defending themselves against one another. The human body evolves to defend itself against incoming aggressive pathogens. In fact, the whole field of immunology is based upon this idea. I would venture that there is probably not a person in this room who does not think of his or her immune system as a system of defense. My immunity is down and I caught a cold. Vitamin therapy supports the immune system. So does exercise. A strong immune system helps us fight off infection. My immune system is battling infection. Who would disagree with these statements? To emphasize this belief, we picture the immune system as an army of defenders to children asking us what it is. In fact, immunologists tell us that there would be no immune system at all without this recognition and elimination concept. But there are problems with this model. The first problem is that in order for a virus to bind with a cell, the cell and the virus have to be symbiotic. The cell has to have surface receptors into which the virus fits. There has to be similarity. And that has led evolutionary biologists to the startling idea that the viruses probably evolved out of normal cell genes, which means that these so-called invaders that we defend ourselves from are really quite a bit more like us than we would be otherwise willing to admit. They may even be ancient parts of self, former selves, if you will. That viruses probably evolved out of very ancient parts of self may strike anyone in this audience as a very Jungian idea. But it gets even more complicated when we ask about the nature of a virus. In fact, viruses do not at all invade cells. They can't. Cells bring life to viruses. Viruses cannot, contrary to what Darwinians, at least the selfish gene contingency, have steadfastly maintained, they can't recognize, scout, trick, discover, alert, evade, sense, recruit, mobilize, prod, mask, defend, scavenge, attack, invade, adapt, appropriate, sacrifice, and kill. Because they have no mobility in and of themselves and cannot even respond to environmental stimuli. Viruses can float around for millennia or be frozen in a polar ice cap only to be released millions of years later, say by global warming. Like genes, they have no capacity to be invasive or selfish. Viruses and genes only contain information that your living cells and mine must bring life to. As it turns out, our immune systems are really much more like information search engines than they are defense mechanisms. They encounter dangerous information so as to adjust successfully or unsuccessfully to it. And I could give you some more details about this, and this is coming from immunology, not from me. We now accept this to be the case because there is no, never was, and never can be any way of establishing beforehand if my body's bringing to life new kinds of viral information that I encounter on a daily basis will be life-enhancing, sickening, or deadly. Yes, we do not know what the consequences of engaging this information will be, but what we do know is that if we do not engage at all, we will end up like the little isolated Amazonian native for whom the common cold is deadly. This bit is biologically important. It is all well and good to look back on successful risk encounters and say that we survived them because we were the fittest. But that tells us nothing about whether we should seek risks out or avoid them. As Anthony says of the flight-fight syndrome, and I'm quoting him, the actual experience of anxiety is directly associated with physiological changes that prepare the body for violent action. All these changes are caused by activation of the sympathetic nervous system and have the effect of preparing the organism to fight like a demon or run like hell, the fight or flight response. So should we avoid or engage the unknown? Well, what immunology tells us, if it tells us anything, is that we do constantly engage viral information and for the most part adapt without things going too wrongly. The most dangerous viruses, like Ebola for instance, are also quite fragile, so our risks are less often deadly. Immunity, then, is just as much, perhaps even more, about adjusting to the way our ancient past evolves over time as it is about protecting myself from foreign invasion. This also, I would suggest, is not only a very Jungian idea, but one that is supported by Anthony's focus on the Jungian engagement with the biological sciences and with creative difference. The flip side of Darwin's intensive focus on defending boundary maintenance and preservation, of being xenophobic about what we do not know, is then a less masculine, boundaried self that takes whatever risks are necessary to know itself by being aware of its own ancient past, of being xenophilic about what we do not know, of being attracted to difference, not merely trying all the time to destroy difference militarily. We need to engage this ancient information in order to adapt. And this is where modern immunology conforms to Anthony's plea that we attend to the ancient parts of self, to the truth of what we all participate in, but that none of us can know fully, that is, to the archetype. One would be hard-pressed to find another thinker, let alone one nearly as creative and adventuresome as Anthony Stevens, who has taken seriously Jung's belief that archetypes have the same biological reality as does the subject matter of any other form of science. Referring to the influence of his mentor, Berenice Schempernaun, Anthony remarks of her belief that archetypes, and he said this in his, I wasn't aware he was going to say this in his film, the same passage, are biological entities that, like our examples of viruses, have a natural history. And I won't go on to quote the passage about the bird building its nest and so forth, but as you recall, it includes this aspect of the archetype, the purely biological one, is the proper concern of scientific psychology. The archetype is an inherited way of functioning, Anthony says, but like the collective unconscious, something that can never be fully known by an individual. That is because, from the standpoint of the individual psyche, the experience of the archetype is subjective. And again, I've got that same passage here, which I will again just say briefly. Here the archetype presents itself as numinous, that is, it appears as an experience of fundamental importance. Whenever it clothes itself in the appropriate symbol, which is not always the case, it puts the individual in a state of possessiveness, the consequences of which may be incalculable. This is where Anthony's understands and explores Jung's interest in Immanuel Kant. Throughout Jung's work, there are recurring references to Kant and his critique of pure reason, and I'm quoting Anthony here, with its unequivocal statement that there can be no empirical knowledge that is not already caught and limited by an a priori structure of cognition. Jung equates this a priori structure with the archetypal determinants of the phylogenetic psyche, what he often referred to as the objective psyche as well as the collective unconscious. He considered that it was these archetypal structures which controlled the perceptual mechanism, determining the relative salience of different stimuli arising from both outside and inside the individual's personal boundaries. And we've heard a lot about this in very interesting ways from previous speakers. As Anthony says, this way of thinking comes dangerously close to becoming inwardly focused and solipsistic. That is, in part, why Jung was so attracted to the archetypal possibilities of collective forms that were both biological and psychological. Among the many ways in which Antony's thinking is truly perceptive is in its understanding of the Kantian part of Jung that saw psychological introspection as vulnerable unless it could posit externalized biopsychosocial things, like viral information, that we each need to participate in socially in order to know. For like Kant, Jung recognized that subjectivity would always have a logical weakness. For him to say that I can only know what is made available to my sensate mind is not to say that there is nothing beyond sensation, but to acknowledge that whatever may exist beyond that is something we cannot know in a complete manner. There is a choice to be made, in other words, between staying at home in my mind with the knowledge that I can only know what I perceive and feel, and believing that the borders between myself and the unknown are, like my immune system's relation to viruses, filled with creative potential. What Kant recognized was that deciding between these outlooks was both a choice and a commitment, and like many explorers, Kant made his decision. This unknowable but ultimate kind of reality Kant named the thing in itself, Ding an sich, and he opposed it to the sensational apprehensions of things that would become the focus of phenomenology and depth psychology from Hegel onward. In this subtle but most profound realization of Kant, Jung, and Stevens, we see not only the limitations of the Enlightenment and its separation of body and mind, but also a positive and hopeful domain full of ritual and experiential possibilities. The noumenon, a thing existing beyond the senses, was to be understood as potentially transcendent and in part as something much greater than any individual's sensory capabilities. Kant knew, in other words, that the truly most profound existential question was less whether knowledge could be independent of human sensation, and more whether we could ever accept the limitations of cognition itself. Here we see why Kant was truly our first anthropologist, and why he is the first philosopher to take anthropology seriously. Here we also see what a profound contribution Jung made to the history of ideas, one that Antony has spent much of his career calling our attention to. In fact, in Kant's formulation, the questions of anthropology reign higher than those of philosophy, ethics, or religion. For the awareness of how paradigms frame our limitations is at the core of Kant's most famous epistemological question, what can I know? In other words, a kind of necessary humility that requires us to see the quite radical scope of this form of anthropology, of Jung's psychology, and of Antony's psychobiology, at once participating in the Enlightenment and also seeing its serious limitations. Indeed, anthropology provides us with many examples of cultures in which moral obligation centers less on individuation than on one's responsibility to bring to life primordial things that would otherwise remain unknowable and potentially dangerous when neglected. In Balinese culture, for instance, rituals must be performed to stabilize not only the Balinese world, but also your world and mine. Likewise, much of Navajo ritual is dedicated to bringing back to life in ever new form primordial things that otherwise lie as dormant and lifeless as a virus without its life-giving cell. Allow me briefly to quote the third and fourth verses of the Navajo beginning of the world song. The earth will be from the very beginning, I have thought it. The mountains will be from the very beginning, I have thought it. The earth will be from ancient times, I speak it. The mountains will be from ancient times, I speak it. As anthropologist Gary Witherspoon points out, for the Navajo, and I'm quoting him, beauty is not so much a perceptual experience as a conceptual one. Our role as humans is to engage and bring to life our shared primordial condition and to reshape it for the better. Otherwise, the opposite will become manifest. As Antony points out of both Kant and Jung, this can become a wholly solipsistic act if we believe that the world around us is only what we think of it. But if we believe that there are autonomous collective ideas like bits of virus waiting to be re-engaged, that it is our obligation to bring to life and negotiate with, even though, or perhaps especially because, we can never know them fully, then we position ourselves to take the creative risks necessary to become fulfilled human beings. For in both Navajo and Balinese cultures, and indeed in so many others, it is critical that humans attend to the question of, what can I know? And to do so fully aware that I can never actually know completely those very primordial things, be they genes or archetypes that shape the foundation on which a me is created. So my self-awareness is critical, as is my awareness of how limited my cognitive abilities might be. Things in themselves, like archetypes and like biology itself, not only are made by me, but also make me, and in turn allow me to make myself better by engaging with others around me. This is why what can't be known must be explored, even if it can never be made fully available to individual cognition. Why it is important to attend to the things we may actually never know fully. Being aware, in other words, of the fact that there are things that we cannot know completely, but that our future livelihood is dependent on, is a core theme of why anthropologists study other cultures, of why Jung's ideas strike us as so anthropologically relevant, and of why Antony's interest in biology and how archetypes evolve over time is so critical to the future of humankind. It is not, in other words, only because we take Kant to be our first anthropologist, or that Jung's collective unconscious echoes what anthropologists say about cultures as a mode of thinking, that causes us to find significance in the relationships I've described briefly today. It is because of this. Even if what Antony has spent his life describing is only partially true, the need to attend to how archetypes manifest themselves in collective thinking when they are ignored is today more critical than ever. Above all, then, Antony offers us again and again a plea to take these ideas not only as therapeutic tools for personal growth and development, but as life-giving and life-taking autonomous collective things that societies must attend themselves to in order to survive and grow. This is why, in my view, Antony has such a deep interest in the relationship between evolutionary biology and the role of archetypes in both stirring up and resolving human conflict. Though today there is no more time for me to talk about so many other unique, important, and intriguing dimensions of Antony's work, I cannot conclude my remarks without some reference to his almost singular crusade to have us think about the relation of biology to psychology in understanding the critical importance of archetypes and their effects on the future of humankind, especially in his The 2-Million-Year-Old Self and the Roots of War. Antony expresses his concern over neglecting archetypes on violent conflict and emphasizes that we must be aware and vigilant of our own capacity for evil. To discuss the crucial nature of this dimension of Antony's work would have taken another hour or indeed a series of lectures. But I cannot conclude my remarks today without pointing out one element of Jung that Antony has tirelessly embraced, one that so many others make less of, and that is Jung's sense of urgency in acknowledging the importance of not neglecting our collective history and the consequences, social, psychological, biological, of such neglect. Of why, that is, we are at a moment in history when it is especially important to acknowledge the need to be alert. Throughout his life, Jung was plagued by the moral question of why any God, however defined, could intentionally torment his or her most loyal followers. In answer to Job, Jung discovers his own answer, and that is, as we all know, that in times of deep social unrest, an individual must become ever more aware, must take personal risks, and must be willing to suffer the contempt of those who blindly consider themselves normal. We do not call a society sick if on its own it can engender health. We call a society sick because it generates pathology. Pathology manifests itself when, for whatever reason, we neglect that Navajo injunction to make beauty out of what we have been given primordially. But when we neglect to do this, our ignorance becomes its own punishment. As Jung said in that anguished book, quote, "One ought not to make oneself out to be more stupid and more unconscious than one really is. For in all other aspects we are called upon to be alert, critical, and self-aware, so as not to fall into temptation, and to examine the spirits who want to gain influence over us, and see whether they are of God, so that we may recognize the mistakes we make." This alertness is what Jung meant by being called on by God. For Jung, God was, in fact, that collectively shared domain of symbolic life that ties us together. Not merely a personified entity, a man or woman-like being to which one prayed. Humans needed, in his view, to believe in the worth and worthiness of the soul, that personal manifestation of collective moral value. For to pretend to be just human, or to pretend to have just a human soul, was for Jung both immoral, because it is a denial of the knowledge you have been gifted, and irresponsible, because it leaves the world more vulnerable to machinations of the darker things we humans are capable of. Calling this darker side evil or demonic, or the effects of bad karma, or negative sensibility, or spiritual insensitivity, or social ignorance, or just doing what we all do, matters less than realizing that our duty as human beings is to be alert to the fact that we can and must shape our world, or it will shape us in ways that can quickly get out of control. What Jung understands in the answer to Job is, in other words, that if for some reason one finds oneself in a place and time where one is capable of realizing, even if faintly, the deeper dimensions of the collective modality of one's era, it becomes one's moral duty to accept the privileged knowledge that has been put before one. Claiming the need for normality in such moments represents the height of moral weakness because, as Edinger says, the collective, the divine as it were, and I'm quoting him, only manifests itself empirically in those relatively few individuals capable of enough consciousness to make ethical decisions, i.e. to decide for good, end quote. In times of mass psychosis, be it in Germany of the late 1930s, or dare I say, in America post 9/11, a good manifestation of the collective depends upon individuals, upon being individually alert, and upon accepting what traditionally might have been called a calling from the divine. This is because in such moments, only individual encounters with the collective can change it, to the extent that we can, quote again, perceive experience as a mirror, and this is Edinger, that provides an image of meaning rather than as chaotic anguish. This is why honest transference with an other is essential, and why consciousness is essential, because if that collective modality, as Jung says, quote, is not humanized and transformed by a sufficient number of conscious individuals, its dark aspect can destroy us, end quote. History has shown us that this is indeed a very dangerous place to be, not only because of its likely outcomes, but because coming to consciousness at such a moment is exceedingly difficult and dangerous at both the individual and the collective levels. As von Franz puts it, the collective shadow has to do with the dark side, the devil, something not human, a thing demonic. Germany went to the devil, people fell into it through their personal shadow, and then did much worse things. The collective shadow, she continues, comes up in mass psychosis. Because mass psychosis, and this is me, is the outcome of a collective of people being so fearful of losing what they have, as say we Americans seem to be right now, that they deny what they really know in favor of short-term, more convenient nodding to whatever figure of authority promises not to destabilize or to restabilize their tenuous grip on what they subconsciously feel to be an endgame world. Above all, what Antony's work reminds us of is how archetypes can again move us today in ways that are potentially quite creative, but only if we cease ignoring the deep dangers of neglect. In conclusion, allow me to thank Antony and the Jung Institute for the invitation to comment on his work and to forgive me for only being able to respond to it partially. For it is so intriguing and challenging in its totality. In the beginning of my talk, I brought up the special need today for moral commitment for figuring out what the right thing to do might be, and for following through on that. Anthony, for me, embodies this principle as much as anyone I know, and in that regard, he also embodies Jung's willingness to go it alone and do what he believes, in spite of the ways his critics in the fearful world might respond or feel compelled to respond to him. Like so many other things, Jung had a way of describing this sense of individual self-sacrifice in a positive way. As Jung said, we all must do what Christ did. We must make our own experiment. He may well have been talking about Anthony Stevens. Thank you very much. Yes.
You just said that people must make their own experiment, that was good. But at the same time, you seem to be implying that there's a morality, the opposite of evil, that has some degree of absolute about it. At least that's the impression I get. And these things keep colliding throughout your talk, in my mind.
I think that's a very good point. Thank you for bringing that up, because clearly the last thing that I would want to suggest as an anthropologist is that there's anything like absolute morality that anyone could know, but one needs to use one's sense of what one thinks to be the right thing to do in order to take action around anything, clearly.
So figure it out.
Yeah, so there is that exact contradiction. What I was trying to get at towards the end of the talk was the fact that doing nothing is not good enough. And so the need for action, whatever it may be, is going to be predicated largely on one's ability to understand how decisions are made at the level of the kinds of contracts that you and I make every time we nod like this. Because when we do this, there's a form of agreement, and what betrayal is we're doing this, but you're doing that, okay? And so that form of engagement, that social engagement, I like to think of sociobiology. We always think about sociobiology. What are the effects of biology on society? Well, it should be the other way around. You know, what are the effects of, and this is what we've heard about all day in the talks, what are the effects of the social engagement on limiting, expanding, controlling, making possible forms of biological engagement? And so that's why I chose the immune system as an example, because it's quite clear to us that you need to engage. And I guess I could do, you need to engage the borders, and the borders are going to be dangerous, and nothing Darwinian is going to tell you whether you're going to see you fail. Right? I mean, that virus comes along, and it's there. If you don't engage it, well, you might not. I mean, if you run off and, try to, for every small allergy that we may have, we try to eliminate that from our environment completely, we may actually avoid it periodically, but then we may become hypersensitive to it as well. And the question of how much you engage is really much more like, is a much more, I would say, avant-garde activity. It's like, not in the artistic sense, but in the military, the original sense. The advance guard go out and they look at the borders and get information and try to assess that. If they don't actually return and become reincorporate them as part of the body of culture or a physical body, if you think about immunity that way, they're useless. I mean, the berserker, may actually win out 1 out of 1,000,000 times, but most of the time the military doesn't want anything to do with them, because this sort of person is going to do all sorts of other berserker things that aren't really in the interest of the collectivity. So that metaphor or reality of what an immune system is, in some ways, to me, is also about the need to engage. The need for more social engagement is a moral demand, really, and it's only in that engagement with another person where those contracts allow you to have a sense of what you think the right thing to do is. Because the problem with betrayal is, and we know this from PTSD, people who study that, it's curable except when betrayal is involved. Why? Because in order for me to acknowledge that I've been betrayed, I have to also acknowledge that I misread all of my social signals for making contracts. I thought I thought the government was going to do this. I thought I was safe when I went to this event. I thought, in other words, all those sensibilities stack up to make us doubt ourselves. And when we doubt ourselves, we are the most vulnerable people to accepting bad meaning over no meaning. So the question of how you get to the social position where you feel like you're taking a calculated risk on a moral assumption, okay, that's better than the alternative is, I think, why the social engagement is so important. Not because it tells us what the right thing to do is, always has to be a private decision, but because it perhaps encourages us to think of why that's important socially. Sorry for the long-winded answer.
Oh, thank you.
Boy, I'm getting off easily. Yes?
Yeah, I'm dealing a lot with subject-object dichotomy. And I always feel that when we define something, therefore we limit it, that it's this and not that, and there we can have this polarization there. Now, if we were not in defining things, if we could actually move into the energy before it is defined, and I'm thinking a little of quantum physics, the energy field versus when we define it as a particle and localize it. If we could hopefully, evolutionary-wise, involve in that, we are what we right now just talk about, then I think we could just be in that awareness, not undefined awareness, but still awareness. Then I think that would give certainly hope to a harmonious way of living there. So for me, energy is a very important thing, and I think the indigenous people, or many of them, they realize more, well, they call it spirit, but that is what gives them security, that's what gives them a ground. And for that reason, there is also not that much of a fear of the outside defined things there. So this is something that fascinates me, but and it's actually quantum physics who I think helps us to, now we're seeing already that everything is connected on an energy level. And if we can live in that with an awareness before we define it then, and then it's this and this, and we don't have that wholeness anymore, I think that would be a good thing.
I quite agree with you. For some years, I worked with homeless people, and I'll never forget one of my homeless people who later became a close friend of mine. And when I was homeless, offered me a place to live. It was an interesting inversion. He once said to me, the problem with people when they look at the homeless is that you do not know what you do not know, and that sounds like a Donald Rumsfeldism. But the fact is that how can you know the limits of your own ignorance? And the only way you can understand the limits of your own ignorance, to get back to the question of moral decision, is in how you explore boundaries in a way that where you're taking calculated risks around the information you need to know to grow. And we have something in anthropology which is related to this. We call it the anthropological paradox. The anthropological paradox is, we say on the one hand, it takes one to know one, and on the other hand, that the hardest thing to know is your own culture. I mean, try being objective and critically examine, as Jung has tried to do throughout his career, your own assumptions. And part of the answer to that is in another anthropological paradox. I like your physics example. I'm just expanding that, exploring it sociologically, and that is the way in which we define culture itself. On the one hand, we say cultures are sets of shared ideas that people, you have to be one to know one, as it were, and that we share ways of living that are determined by nationality, race, ethnicity, gender preference, whatever it happens to be. But there's another definition of culture which is less prominent, and that is one that was wonderfully described by the anthropologist Frederick Barth in a book way back in the 1960s called Ethnic Groups and Boundaries, where he describes culture as an empty vessel. You think about the concept of middle America or the silent majority. in this model, it's the avant-garde model. Culture has defined its peripheries where it's contested and challenged. And of course, what happens after 9/11? The flags come out of the cupboards, right? I mean, in a way, if you aren't aware of your boundaries become aware of you. And this is so much to do with fears about migration. When people think about immigration that's totally, to me, self-destructive, is realizing or not realizing that people who migrate to other places know more about the places they're migrating to than the people who accept them know about where they came from. Okay, so if we think that we're better informed by keeping ourselves away from the others, we've got a deep road to plow if we're going to turn that around. And I do think that this is what I find so engaging about Jung's fascination with difference, because he recognizes that it's also ancient parts of self and self-awareness. Thank you. Yes?
There's also the cultures where you could grow things in a dish to make experiments.
Oh, thank you for bringing that up. Can I say something about the Petri dish? That's a wonderful metaphor. I love it, because if you look at anybody, a cell biologist knows, if you look at a cell colony on a Petri dish, right? The cell colony, it starts on, it proliferates on this. Just go online, look at pictures of ancient cell colonies. You know what? Ancient cell colonies, they get dark in the center. You know why? Because these are spores that are producing coatings to protect themselves, right? The cell colony dies from the center, not the periphery. Right? These people, they're like people huddled in the center. They're saying, "No, I want my SUV, and I'm going to live this way, no matter what." Right? There's a lot of life expressed at the periphery of a dying colony. Now, those cells are dropping off. They're like homeless people. They're falling off the plate. But the liveliness is not expressed in the middle. Thank you for that. David.
Thank you very much, David. I would like, before we start our panel, and we're going to have a hard stop at 4:30, to ask you to join me in singing Happy Birthday to Tony Stevens. So you can use the name Tony when we sing the song.
Are we Skyping him?
We're filming, and we're going to send him a film of all the speakers and the events today so that he'll be able to enjoy it in Corfu. And for those of you who came in late, we will put his film on our website, and you'll be able to see his beautiful film if you missed it, or if you'd like to see it again. So if you could join me at the count of 3 to sing Happy Birthday, Tony. Okay? 1, 2, 3. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Tony. Happy birthday to you. Thank you so much. Gentlemen, please take a seat up here.
Maybe.
All set? Okay. So one of the very interesting ideas, one of the chief interesting ideas that Anthony Stevens has brought forth is his concept of the frustration of archetypal intent. And he was referring to it with his idea of parent hunger. So I'm a patient who comes to see you, and I have frustration of archetypal intent syndrome, and I have parent hunger. How does that inform how you treat me? Anyone on the panel, all the panel?
How much do they charge you?
Get the junior.
Only paying the one who has the best answer.
Smart move. Do you want to go?
Sure.
Well, of course, I see this sort of patient constantly in practice, and oftentimes they come in with this parent hunger, but it's more specific than that. It's a good, healthy, secure type of parent hunger, and that's the archetypal part of it. I think is that we know somehow instinctively that that's what we're looking for when we go into the relationship, and that when the parent doesn't meet that need, or parental figures, however many there may be, that's when the conflict starts. And at least from my perspective, I would tend to see rage towards this parental figure for that sort of thing. At the exact same time, a very powerful longing for what they don't have. And that sort of push-pull is what they oftentimes bring into therapy. And all of that, of course, gets projected onto me. And that's just the transference of it. I don't know if that answers the question.
It does in part. And so, since I'm seeing you and you know this about me, how does it help me?
Well, it helps to understand the behaviors as they manifest in therapy, because the patient's living with a longing for a secure bond while at the same time having a fear of that same secure bond, and as well as the anger and frustration towards those figures who do not provide that. All those things exist at the same time within the unconscious. But consciously, it's difficult for the consciousness to handle all that at once, so it tends to bounce back and forth. And one of the tricks in therapy is to try and recognize when one or the other is coming in to play, and then bringing it into awareness, talking about it. Not in a judgmental way, of course, but to say, well, that longing is a natural longing. It's a biological longing, as is also the frustration and the fear. And that helps to normalize it, and ideally, anyway, it brings those things more into balance as you welcome them all into the conscious space. But when they first come in, it's so intense and emotional that it floods, and then it recedes, and the other one floods and then recedes, and so forth. That's the way I look at it.
So you will become the source of parental feeding for me that will then satisfy my archetypal need?
Hopefully not. And I only say that because if you go just there and leave it, then you become the bond that they have to keep forever. And so you never allow them to grieve what they did lose. And that's all about termination. So to get to that level, though, you have to bring it into all of it into the awareness to the level where they can appreciate it from a more objective standpoint. If that makes sense.
So then I would have the experience that the answer to my archetypal frustration is within me.
Yes. Right.
Which would be a life-changing experience.
Very much so. Because they think it's out there somewhere all the time.
Right. Did you want to make some remarks on it?
Sure. I didn't know there was going to be a test.
I didn't study.
Right. My approach is to try to be curious about what the longing is, what the longing's about, what the longing is compensating for, and with someone who comes in with a more high valence disturbance in attachment or in a parental relationship that gets activated in the context of the analysis, I tend to be much more present and much more engaged with someone like that when there's such a high affective valence. And I know that goes against many people's thinkings about how to engage a patient in that state. But what I find is that by making the relationship simultaneously real in the room and leaving room for what the longing is serving, and being able to talk about not just about what's happening but what's not happening, what the the desperation may make clear to us. It's a way, I think, of getting to that position where the patient understands that their desire, their need, is something which they can satisfy in their life. They can satisfy, they have the capacity to participate in satisfying that, even if the individual specific interaction relationship may not be satisfying in the moment. And that, I think, creates a capacity to tolerate really kind of extreme experience, which sometimes people find profoundly disturbing and disabling. So, in a way, the more extreme the valence of the need, I think the more present I tend to be in the room with the person as we're trying to understand it.
Okay, now I'd like to take the, oh, go ahead, please.
Oh, do you want me?
No,
You can take it in another direction. I'm not a therapist, so.
No, I was actually going to ask a question directed at you.
Go ahead.
My question is going to be, what about when the parent hunger and the frustration of archetypal intent are a society-wide phenomenon? And how do we approach it under those circumstances?
Juicy question.
Yeah. Maybe I'll take the last question. Let me. I can say something about that. My area of interest historically, as an anthropologist, there are several. I mentioned the homeless and biomedical culture, but in the field I've studied healing rituals, particularly in Hindu, Buddhist healing rituals in South and Southeast Asia. And one of the things that I notice about people collective destabilization is that people need to find places where they can establish local meaning, because if one thinks about it in the terms of today's event, that archetypal, those archetypal signals are present everywhere around us, and the question of how we apprehend them and how we assimilate them and aren't blind to them, I think is critical. So if I can give you, I'll just give you an experimental example. I've asked everyone to close your eyes for a moment, raise your right hand. Okay. Point to the Empire State Building. Open your eyes. Once you've done, well, everyone, a lot of people aren't pointing. Come on, point. Okay. Now open your eyes. Don't move your hands, just open your eyes. You can see where everyone's pointing. Okay. Now, this is partially a function of the fact that to use another radical example, unlike people in this country move on average every 3.5 years. So we are separated from our local environments in extreme ways on a daily basis. If you go to Indonesia, if you go to Bali, people say, "Oh, the Balinese are all artistic," but probably half of you have been there on holidays. You know, the fact of the matter is that it's not really very little. Well, no, given what was said today about imagery, it probably has a lot to do with art, but it has less to do with aesthetic sensibility and apprehension than it does with beautifying and understanding, as in the Navajo sense that I expressed, the place in which you exist, so that when you do become destabilized, you have various signals that you can read in your relationships that help you to adjust. A lot of these we would call psychologically problematic, but no more problematic than Jung's having his sandbox and animistic objects are problematic. And in fact, I would recommend that these are techniques through which we re-engage those things in our environment, because once you have established a way of adjusting locally, your adjustments become more local and less transcendental, if you know what I'm saying. That is to say, you're not going to Arizona to look for a spaceship to take you to eternity. You're more likely to want to cultivate your local garden. Part of this is because you're going to be reborn to the same place. In Balinese society, reincarnation is not about going from a king to a fish to a dog to a lizard to a snail, but it's basically about being reborn into the same lineage. So when I look at you, I say, I find the features of your grandmother, and you may have her name, and you are literally, which makes a lot more sense to us genetically today than that it did in times when people thought that these were odd superstitions. but in actual fact, you have mechanisms that actually allow you to engage experientially in forms of embodied knowledge that aren't necessarily cognitive, that I think allow for the conveyance of that essential information, so that when you are destabilized, I mean, I just give you an example compared to what you just saw with the hands going this way, those ways. I remember once in Bali being in a van very late at night, and it's volcanic, so the roads all go like this, and whenever there's another volcano every 20 years, the road systems change. There are no, at least at that time, the country island was not electrified, so they're just glowing lamps here and there in the jungle. You have really no idea of where you are. And for the Balinese, you know, the ancestral place is high, of course, like in Greece, Mount Olympus, whatever. It's Mount Agung in the center, and the ocean is the place where things, the left-hand path, as it were. We won't call them demonic, but the other things that we associate that are the chaotic things, and towards the mountain is therefore auspicious, and towards the sea inauspicious. So you already have a mechanical way of why you give someone something with your right hand if you're feeling a little bit destabilized. It doesn't mean people don't use both hands, but it means they defer in moments of instability to certain ways of relating to one another, huh? Which is really a really interesting thing to say. And it comes down to daily practice. So on this particular bus ride, in the middle of the night, it's the back of a truck. You slide into church seats, you know, just slide in the next one. And towards the mountain is Kaja, towards us is Kalod. And the man in the back collecting the fare says, Kaja, 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 you know, move towards the mountain. I mean, he knew in his head, he had an idea of where the Empire State Building was. No matter where he went, you could turn him around 1,000 times and he would point to it, because that was his focus of symbolic orientation. And of course, what that also meant, that he could point to various people he had relations with. He understood, you know, how he could make his life a little bit more aesthetically beautiful if he felt destabilized. Didn't mean that he was always neurotic about the left and the right, but he could go there if he needed to, and he could try to manage himself in that local setting. And I'll finish the long answer, but I'll finish this very quickly. That when the Bali bombings went off, and everybody says, "Oh, this is Australia's 9/11," the nightclub bombings, the Balinese said, "No, that's not what's happening. This is actually an internal affair, and it's actually Muslims." Orthodox Muslims angry with capitalist Muslims about investing in nightclubs where prostitutes and drugs are sold. So it was a revenge and punishment, and also about destroying Bali's tourist industry. And so what the Balinese did, and this is the point, not to cast blame on why it happened, but the response was very interesting, because Balinese said, "What did we do to have this conjunction of events happen right now here?" Which is, you know, it's a really interesting question. And one wonders, how many times do we ask that question of ourselves? Never, you know. So I think that there are ways in which societies can adjust and adapt, and don't necessarily have to be pathological. And by the way, you know, let's face it, in post-World War II Germany, you see a lot of moral reconstruction in ways that you don't find elsewhere in the world. I think that's also something that's largely neglected.
You know, I think one of the most powerful implications of Anthony Stevens' work is the idea that psychopathology can be looked at as a result of the frustration of an archetypal pattern that needs to be fulfilled, that's innate in a human being. And it's very different to go see a therapist who has that perspective than to go see one who doesn't. Okay, I'd like to open up the audience for the last 3 or 4 minutes for comments or questions.
What would you guys make out of the bombing in Boston and the people involved? Is that a destabilizing? Or how? I was taken by what you said with the Patriot Act. But how should we be responding?
We can't hear the question.
After the second one was caught, people went into the streets and shouted, "USA, USA," which seems to be the response now, like we're playing the football game. And but I was wondering if you guys have any impressions.
that response, I don't know a whole lot about that event because I've been busy with other things, but,
Could you rephrase the question?
well,
What do they think of the Boston?
Say the question, someone.
right, the question was, what do we think about the response to the event in Austin? It was the marathon. You're talking about people shouting USA, and I think that's just a very primitive sort of sense of who are we? Let's just talk about our identity now. It's a kind of like what you were talking about, a cultural structuring sort of almost ritualistic behavior that possibly provides some sort of stability, temporarily though it may be. And that's about all I've got on that one.
Sure. I think there's both a component of kind of asserting resilience, and resilience in the form of sort of, the football cheer about we won, which leaves aside any kind of more nuanced understanding of why it happened. I think, part of my response to, or part of my thinking about what happened was, I was just struck by the use of the pressure cookers as a bombing device, and I know that's something that's been done before in South Asia, but there's something about almost a sort of an explosive quality in the sort of negative maternal domain, where there's something of a lashing out and a sense of frustration, a sense of humiliation. And it's a little bit paradoxical given what little bit I think we know about the perpetrators. But I don't think people have even begun to think about that yet. And I think the first response is more just to assert resilience, and then understanding is something which, frankly, I think a lot of people are not that interested in. And I think that's just part of human nature. And I think hopefully those of us who are interested in those things can take the time to try to digest it and articulate it in a little bit more of a nuanced way. But I don't think anything's happened other than, oh boy, we survived, isn't that great? You look, I've got all my arms and legs, I've got all my fingers and toes.
Obviously, I think it's a very it's a dangerous time to make assumptions about anything, but one of the things that struck me, first of all, I think it's in terms of the crowd behavior afterwards. I'd have to really withhold any judgment, because I think when people do feel wounded, as many Americans do, that those responses are not necessarily only their responses. That is to say that they're reflecting other sorts of things that they feel that they don't understand, or that they've heard, or that they've embodied, and so there was an expression of collective consensus that was evidenced. The thing that bothers me more about these events is the way in which, first of all, unfortunately, the older brother, who clearly had more, as it were, skill sets in this than the younger one, did not survive, and therefore one will never know more about his motivations. But the way in which the younger 19-year-old boy, in terms of brain development, right, is described as a dangerous man, and also what will invariably be the flip side of that, which is people will say, oh, he outran the whole police force, right? And I think that part of the problem there is the fact that, what really bothered me yesterday before this thing was concluded was the way in which I listened to our supposedly most responsible NPR all day, as probably most people did, and it astonished me, the innuendos that were cast about as only possible. We're not saying this is the case, but, right? And then it's what followed the but, which seemed to me to be incredibly irresponsible behavior on the part of people who are supposed to be helping us to regain our sense of ourselves as intelligent people. And if it's not there, then where do you find it? I mean, where do you find, and I think that this is where organizations such as this one, or universities, for example, really have to take up their moral obligation because, governments can't, and radio stations that depend upon private donation are struggling to survive. That we have to accept that we have privileges to be here today that a lot of people don't, and that therefore there are obligations that go along with that at some level. And I'd rather be thinking about right now less about people who are very wounded and afraid in Boston and how they respond in a moment of fear, because I probably may have done the same thing that they did, were I standing there. Then I am thinking about, I'm a bit more comfortable in thinking about why as a country we aren't more concerned and feel more confident, in fact, about taking up our own moral obligations as they relate to understanding how something so, at this moment, completely inexplicable could have happened.
Well, that concludes our program. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you to our panelists for their speeches and for the panel. And thank you, Anthony Stevens, for your marvelous contribution. We love you, Anthony.